This week on The Destination Angler.
The thing I love about Spring Creek fish is the quality of the fish that you get an opportunity to interact with is super high.
Yeah.
And I find that if you're patient and you approach them slowly, you'll learn more about how fish behave on a Spring Creek than I think you can on any other river. Because where else do you get to watch fish so intensively feeding from, you know, crowd, rooting around getting nymphs, eating emergers, eating dry flies, and then eating the fish the spinners. So that's what's really cool about it's a great trout classroom.
And that was Dan Vermillion on the Spring Creeks of Central Montana. Hey, if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and share the podcast with a buddy. Welcome to the Destination Angler Podcast, the podcast for anglers who travel. And I'm your host, Steve Haig. We go right to the source, the local guides and experts, to build your knowledge of top fishing locations around North America. It's a big world out there. Now go and fish it.
I'm going away for a while, but I'll be back soon. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Hey anglers, welcome back to another episode of the Destination Angler, brought to you by Got Fishing, crafting world-class fly fishing adventures specially designed to your level of experience and budget. By Trout Routes, the #1 fishing app, helping trout anglers avoid the crowds and explore new public water. Download it today on the App Store and get 20% off using promo code DESTINATION20. By Adams Built Fishing Gear, the trusted source for quality fly fishing gear built to last at an affordable price. And by Angler's Coffee, fueling your next cast with amazing coffee delivered to your doorstep one batch at a time. Get started today and save 20%. Up next on the Destination Angler, we journey to Mexico and the Baja Peninsula for some incredible rooster fish on the fly from the surf. And then we head to Tennessee and the world-famous South Holston River for some huge brown and stripers. And be sure to backcast to catch the last episode on the Troutland region of central Finland with Jani Himanko. Central Finland is home to some of the best fly fishing in Europe, not to mention brown trout the size of your leg. You won't want to miss these shows. Today our destination is Big Spring Creek and Warm Spring Creek near the town of Lewistown, Montana. And our guest is Dan Vermillion, co-owner of Sweetwater Travel, Livingston, Montana. Traveling to Lewistown is like stepping back in time to the Montana of yesteryear. Here, anglers will find classic Spring Creek fly fishing along with miles and miles of public water, easy wading, and shots at large, wily trout. A self-proclaimed fly fishing geek, Dan and his brothers were raised on the banks of the Yellowstone River and are now co-owners and operators of the largest collection of fly fishing lodges in the world. Dan received his law degree from the University of Montana, which is, according to Dan, the best law school if you like to fly fish. He has a passion for public service and served as chairman of Montana's Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission. Today, Dan covers Big Spring Creek and Warm Spring Creek from top to bottom, pro tips for spring creeks, and what it was like fly fishing the Yellowstone and the Bighorn in the 70s and 80s. We also touch on Jeremiah Johnson, Joe Brooks, and a great story of guiding Barack Obama, along with some life lessons from Fed Chairman Paul Volker. All right, let's hear from Dan. Well, Dan, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Appreciate your having me.
You bet. I got so many questions for you. These spring creeks we're going to talk about are really just kind of fascinating. I had not heard of Big Spring Creek and Warm Spring Creek. Matter of fact, I hadn't heard of Lewiston, Montana before. So sorry for all you folks in Montana, but hadn't been there. But sounds like these are real hidden gems. They kind of should be on everybody's radar.
Well, they are hidden gems. I mean, I think the thing that makes both Warm Springs and more particularly Big Spring Creek is that it's public. So there's probably, 8 to 10 fishing accesses within 10 miles of Lewistown that are on the Spring Creek where an angler can come in and park at the fishing access site and go out and fish. And, when people think of Spring Creeks in Montana, they typically think of Depews, Nelsons, O'Hares,
Exactly.
Dells, but those are very private creeks. They don't have a high water mark. They don't have a place where you can enter legally, so you have to pay a rod.
Right.
Which, for a large part, I'm very thankful to be able to at least do that. because there's $100 a day is typically a lot cheaper than 15 million for a ranch that has a spring creek. So
So to buy one.
yeah, it's cheaper to rent one for a day than buy one. And these spring creeks up in central Montana are sort of like a lot of Montana that historically didn't have a lot of folks. And as a result, there wasn't a real rush to privatize these sort of assets or these sort of resources. And they've really been part of the community. And Big Spring Creek, there's also that Spring Creek that comes in right downstream of Great Falls, which is the shortest river in the world, they say. And, it's like 100 feet long, but it's a monster spring. It comes in right below the Great Falls of the Missouri.
Okay. Yeah.
And the water, when it comes out of the ground there, is about 57 years old. So,
What do you mean by that? What's that mean?
well, so the water, by the time it works its way all through all the fissures of the mountains, it falls in the mountains about 30, 40 miles south. And by the time it works its way through the fissures, they somehow geologically, I don't know how they do it, but FWP has a plaque up there that talks about how the water that you're seeing coming out of the ground here is over 50 years old. And so these spring creeks are sort of mysterious, right?
Yeah.
Everybody knows that they seem to come from the ground.
Right.
And well, they do come from the ground. But the other really unique thing about them is they don't seem to be affected by climate change the way a lot of our freestone rivers are. So you've got a consistent flow at a consistent temperature. And, in a state like Montana that's really seeing a lot more heat and a lot less rain typically, or the runoff's going off a lot faster, these sort of spring creeks become an important piece to our ability to maintain high quality cold water fisheries. And, if you look at Big Spring Creek on the south end or the top end, about 10 or 12 miles south of Lewistown, there's this place called Big Spring Creek Hatchery. And they don't put fish into the creek, but it's a place where they historically had run broodstock to go out and spawn some of the reservoirs around the state that did not have active self-reproducing or native national, wildly reproducing trout populations. So they use that to supplement it. But the real interesting piece of the Big Spring Creek is that, like in the 50s or 60s, the FWP built all these raceways and they painted the raceways with this particular type of paint. I think it was from Pittsburgh Paints or Benjamin Moore, I don't remember where. And turned out they had a bunch of PCBs in them. So as a result, the water, you couldn't eat the fish. And the one thing, about Lewistown, like central Montana versus the trout fishing part of Montana, fly fishing and fishing in, like, say, Livingston is much more of a catch and release, fly fishing only sort of deal. You get out in central to eastern Montana, it's more of a traditional approach to fishing. There's a lot of people that fly fish, but there's also folks that catch and take them home. But for about 25 or 30 years, you couldn't eat these fish. And so it allowed this fishery just to sort of
turned it into catch and release, I guess.
it turned into catch and release. It's no longer the case, but like a lot of places where you are forced to practice catch and release, eventually it sort of becomes the norm. And but part of that is the state of Lewistown, the city of Lewistown and the state of Montana sued the paint company for contamination and received a very large settlement. I don't remember the exact number. And they used it to buy fishing access sites all up and down the creek and then create a trail system that connects most of the fishing access sites.
Oh, that's great.
So even though it's probably one of the most conservative counties in Montana, it's done as good a job as any county in creating public opportunities for people to go fishing. And, the fishing, it's still a spring creek. So when you think about spring creeks, it's easy when you get away from the crowds of Western Montana to think, well, these fish don't see many flies, are going to be a little easier to catch. And there's still fish that live in spring creeks, and they're very attuned to what they eat. They're a little bit more wide ranging in what they will eat, and they make more mistakes than a fish on Depews or Nelson's. But, there's also, they're really fun fisheries. You've got, and it kind of follows their traditional pattern of midges in the fall and winter, blue winged olives in the spring, followed by some PMDs, and then hopefully some sulfurs and some tricos, caddis. And then, of course, like, because it's out in the prairie, hoppers, right? And the terrestrials that start in August. So it's a really neat fishery. And you can, the whole thing at Big Spring Creek is it's all cold water. So it runs trout pretty much all the way down to where it hits the Judith. you go over to fish Warm Springs Creek, which is I've always sort of considered it sister creek, and it kind of comes out of the ground, well, about 20 miles north and northwest of Lewistown, I would say. And it flows into the Judith as well, about probably 10 miles, 8 miles below where the Big Spring Creek flows in.
Yeah.
And, Warm Springs Creek is not as cold, but like when you
Warm
fish
Springs.
yeah, when you fish it, it's in its 50s and 60s all year. It doesn't get in the 80s
Sounds
necessarily.
good.
But when you float through, I've snorkeled it and I've fished it. When you snorkel it, you're seeing pike, you're seeing smallmouth, you're seeing rainbows, you're seeing browns, you're seeing one of our native fish, the sauger, lots of suckers. So you never know what you're going to catch. And I think that's one of the things that when people think about Montana, if you're a fly fisherman, you really think about trout fishing, right? And Montana's changing. There's still great trout fishing, but our fisheries are becoming a little bit more broad based as far as the fish that are taking over some of our rivers. You don't see it up, way up. They've now caught smallmouth bass up in Yellowstone Park.
Oh,
So
really? Wow.
they're moving up these rivers. They're moving up the Yellowstone. And so, when you get out in eastern Montana, that process has been going on for a bit longer. And they're traditionally, Warm Springs and Big Springs Creek, I don't suspect were traditionally trout fishers, although I don't know, whether, they used to have cutthroat, West Slope cutthroat like other streams in Montana or not. You don't see those now, whereas you do see them in the Judith. So tributary to in the Judith River that both the Warm Springs and Big Springs flow into has West Slope cutthroat. But when you're up on Big Springs and Warm Springs, I haven't caught those. Not saying they're not there, but I just haven't caught them.
Well, let me pause you just for a second because I wanted to just kind of orient us for a minute. Like where in Montana, you were talking about central Montana, but orient us. Where is this?
So if you look at Lewistown, Montana, it literally is considered to be the geographical center of the state. And if you go to Lewistown, Montana, you'll go to right at their town square there by the Yogo Sapphire Inn. And it has a big star, which is considered to be the geographical center of the state.
Okay.
But, for a person who's doesn't want to take the ruler out and figure out where the geographical middle is, it's about 2.5 hours north of Billings.
Okay.
Northwest.
Due north, isn't it?
Yeah, just about. And then same, it's probably 2 hours east of Great Falls and about 3 hours northeast of Bozeman.
Okay. All right. And what's the scenery out this way?
It's different. It's more of like what I would call it's ponderosa pine. There's a lot of different pines, but the mountain ranges, when you think about Western Montana, it's kind of one steady mountain range intersected by valleys. Eastern Montana is bigger valleys, and the mountain ranges are very isolated. So like the Crazy Mountains behind me here where we're talking today, the Bull Mountains, the Pryor Mountains, the Bear Paws, the Rocky Boys, the Judiths, the Snowies, those are all central Montana ranges, and they're isolated Rocky Mountain ranges that are, I assume, pretty new ranges because they're super sharp, but they're not as high. So they're further from, I guess that traditional fault line that created the Rocky Mountains, but they're spectacular, but they're not, most of them are not above tree line.
Okay, so bigger, wider valleys, but still mountainous, rolling hills. I mean, when I looked online, it looked beautiful out that way.
It is beautiful. It's probably the best hunting in the state, and it's certainly, for me, when I take my kids fishing or my son fishing, it's kind of where we usually head is out to central Montana.
Wow, no kidding. Okay, you mentioned the Crazy Mountains. I heard a story that they're named after the crazy lady in the true Jeremiah Johnson story who was in those mountains. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, the story that's always told out here is because the Bozeman Trail crosses just south of the Crazy Mountains, and you used to come through Sioux and Crow Country to get to the gold fields of western Montana. The story that we've always heard is that the woman was in a wagon train and they ran into an angry group of Native Americans who said, "Not today," and she lost her family and to a skirmish, and she went running off in the mountains, never to be seen again. So who knows? For the Crow tribe, they're considered very sacred mountains from a vision perspective. They go up there to do their vision quests, but they're really special mountains, and they're the close isolated range, so to speak, to the Rockies. So they're higher. And as you get further north and further east, They're not as high. They're more a blend between prairie and mountains.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is there a fly shop in Lewiston?
That's the thing about anybody that's thinking about fishing this part of the world is it's not built up with traditional infrastructure for the fly fishermen. There's a sporting goods store called Don's Sporting Goods in Lewistown, and they've got probably the best. You can buy a pistol and a Royal Wolf side by side. So
What else do you need?
yeah, exactly. So there's sporting goods stores. I wouldn't call them fly shops per se.
Okay.
And as far as I know, there are no guides. So, I mean, you get out to Fort Peck and stuff, there's guides, but there really are not trout guides out in central Montana.
What I read about these creeks is that they were kind of made famous by a 1959 article by Joe Brooks in Outdoor Life, and he called it the stream that has everything. He was talking about Big Spring Creek. Why don't these streams get a little more attention?
That's a good question. I kind of assume it has something to do with the fact that Montana had so much good fishing that was more accessible and a touch more scenic. It really depends on what sort of scenery you want when you come to Montana.
Yeah.
If I had to choose, I'd be in central Montana, but the traditional scenery that people really like are the more spectacular mountains like Paradise Valley, the Madison,
Right.
the Gallatin.
That's pretty.
And it's beautiful and it's great fishing and it's a great place. And I just think that, folks had a week to 2 weeks a year, unlike Joe Brooks, who would be out here for the whole summer. And, they just can't go everywhere. It's a big state.
Yeah, exactly. So it sounds like there are more than 3 spring creeks in the state of Montana, Depews, Armstrongs, and Nelsons, huh?
There
There's
are
a
a few
couple
more,
more.
yeah. Well, and see, that's the thing about people have to, fishing in this part of the state really requires time. The fish are not as dense. And, the cool thing about the Warm Springs Creek and Big Springs Creek is you don't need a boat. You can float the Warm Springs Creek pretty easy, or Big Spring Creek. Warm Springs is not something I'd recommend floating just because there's a lot of fences and stuff and smaller ranches, but you can float Big Springs Creek, but you can also just get out, like I said, all those fishing access sites, and you can leave one car below and one car above and just walk right up.
Yeah.
And, as with a lot of fishing access sites, as soon as you get more than about 350 yards above the takeout, you typically find that most people don't venture much past that.
Interesting. I was on trout routes this morning, just kind of looking at things, and it looks like like you said, there's a ton of public access. It's kind of like pieces and parts along the way, but it looks like there's some great public access. And can you kind of get away from the crowds over here? Maybe that's why.
Yeah, I mean, you can. I mean, the one thing to think about, like Montana, I mean, that part of Montana, like I said, doesn't really have a recreational sports fishing industry.
Yeah.
So, weekends are clearly going to be a little busier. Evenings when guys get off work are going to be a little busier. But most of the folks that live in Lewistown are making their living either ranching or, working at kind of 9 to 5 or 8 to 10, different jobs. So during the day, the streams are typically it's a really blue collar area, and it's not a vacation area per se.
Right.
And there's natural openings in people's schedules where you can kind of fish to yourself.
I mean, I noticed that there's along with the public land, obviously there's a lot of private land as well. I mean, could you go knock on a door? And
you sure could. I mean, I think that's the other thing is like when you get closer to Bozeman and Livingston, there's people that are kind of getting bombarded by people asking to fish, right?
Gosh.
There's just a lot of folks. But when you're out in that neck of the woods in central Montana, it's completely different. Now, if you ask a pheasant hunt or elk hunt, different story. But if you just want to go catch a trout, they're like, yeah, sure, go ahead. Watch out for the rattlesnakes. That's about it.
Right. Okay. All right. With so much information out there, it can get darn right confusing and even overwhelming to find the right fishing adventure. Sorting through all the options and fees can be quite the headache. Well, not anymore. I'm super excited to introduce Got Fishing. Got Fishing is a boutique booking agency for world-class fishing adventures around the world. They ensure that you are on the exact fishing trip that meets your skill level, budget, and desired experience. Whether you're a seasoned angler or new to the sport, Got Fishing's personalized service will help you decide which adventure is the best fit for you, your group, or even your business. Worry about fees? Worry no more. With Got Fishing, you won't pay anything extra because their services are entirely free for you. You see, Got Fishing exclusively partners with highly reputable outfitters who gladly compensate them for their services, ensuring a win-win situation. Explore the range of fishing adventures and learn more about the services Got Fishing provides at gotfishing.com. That's www.gotfishing.com. And check them out on Instagram too. Do you struggle finding new trout streams to explore? Tired of stumbling around country roads looking for access points? Looking to escape the crowds? Then look no further, because Trout Routes has meticulously mapped and classified over 50,000 trout streams covering the entire lower 48, including 350,000 hand-curated public access points marked and ready for you to explore. I'm a huge fan of Trout Routes because they make it so easy to explore new trout waters. Many times, Trout Routes has helped me find new public water and get into fish fast. And the good folks at Trout Routes have been busy this winter making Trout Routes even better. Enter Stream Cards 2.0, the latest iOS release that brings together more info at your fingertips by organizing data like stream flows, access laws, nearest fly shops into easily accessible tabs for every river and stream in the app. And now you can check real-time stream height and flow rates with river data from stream gauges and compare those with historical data to spot trends. Pretty cool, huh? Planning a trip? Well, you'll love the advanced filter features that let you hone in on top-rated streams, boat ramps, camping spots, and more. So what are you waiting for? Start exploring today by downloading Trout Routes on your Apple or Android phone. Well, let's talk about I'll call it the character of the water. I want to understand, like if I'm going out there, kind of set my expectations, maybe starting with Big Spring Creek. What's the water like?
Yeah, so like the top of Big Springs Creek is as close to like if you've ever fished the chalk streams in England or Depews, and really rich aquatic bugs and really rich aquatic plant life. So it looks just like a traditional spring creek. It really does, with the beautiful weeds, the fish feeding in lanes and what have you. But as you get further down, more out in the prairie, it's sort of like the Yellowstone, where it transitions into a more of a, not a warm water fishery, but a warmer cold water fishery. So the bug life may not be as intense, but there's bigger fish. And especially when the terrestrials are happy, the fishing, people move downstream. The fish are generally bigger the lower in the creek you go.
Oh, they are. Okay.
Yeah,
Maybe
in my
a
experience.
little more sparse, but bigger.
Yep. And most of the fishing pressure is above town or to the south of town. If you get below town, there's a lot fewer people.
And it looks like it's a meandering stream, lots of undercut banks and.
Very much so. It's there's not a lot of cows through there, despite it being cattle country. So the banks are in good shape. Typically, the riparian areas are in good shape, and there's not a lot of really fast water. It's not super deep. Not a lot of big boulders. It's really nice. Looks like one big spotting channel, honestly. A lot of gravel, somewhat sediment. As you get down lower in the creek, I mean, like Depews and O'Hare's, they're 3 miles long, right? 4 miles long.
Yeah.
This thing's like 30 miles long. So it picks up sediment. So as the lower you go, it's less clean gravel, more bigger rocks with, just some sediment that settles, because there is a lot of irrigating. There's a lot of hay ground. So you do have, it does sort of change the character of the water. Clearly it slows down, but even from the top to the bottom, by and large, it's just riffle, pool, right? It's just
Nice.
riffle, pool. It's a very nice place.
And like I said, since it's meandering, I'm going to find lots of undercut banks and pools and those kinds of sections.
Yeah. And so what you'll find is that you'll look at a run, and if there's not a lot of bugs working, you're not going to see any fish, right?
Yeah.
You're going to say, where the hell are the fish? They're going to be sitting down in the weeds, or they're up underneath those cut banks, just kind of relaxing and waiting until they need to expose themselves. So then you kind of have to pry them out with fishing those banks with terrestrials. But, you could say, oh, I'm close to the bank, but if you're 6 inches, you're too far away.
Wow.
You need to be an inch or two, because they are literally sitting underneath the bank, 6 inches, probably underneath where you'd be standing. It's a cavern, and they won't come out, and they don't see it unless it's right next to shore.
So you got brown trout in there then?
Yep.
Okay. No rainbows?
Oh, you do have a lot of rainbows too. It's browns and rainbows mostly.
Browns and rainbows. Do you find the rainbows hold a little bit more out in the open, or are they still tucked
Yeah,
up
I
under?
would say so. I mean, the rainbows are more going to be like, they're more of the classic aquatic insect feeder in the creek, whereas they're out there eating nymphs, and whereas the browns are usually looking for bigger meals.
They want a big piece of meat.
Sculpins, things like that.
Gradients, I'm assuming if it's meandering, gradients are pretty low.
They are. It's easy wading. Sometimes, the banks are kind of tricky. So like if you're an older gentleman, I would recommend having a wading stick because it
Oh,
allows you to, how cut banks are, they're kind of uneven. And once you're in the water, it's easy, but getting in can sometimes be tricky. But if you have a wading stick, it makes it a lot easier.
okay. Are there some tributaries to these creeks that are worth fishing? Cottonwood Creek looked like a good sized creek.
Cottonwood Creek is good. It's got a little bit, it's pretty private. But if you get up into the forest, I mean, that's the thing about central Montana is it really doesn't get much fishing pressure.
Yeah.
So when people show up to a place like Lewistown and they're looking at their map, if it looks like it has water all year long, go fish it.
It's got fish.
It usually has fish. I mean, if it's out in the prairie and it's 78-degree water, clearly it doesn't. But if you're up in the mountains, and there's plenty of mountains around that, you will find fish.
Yeah.
And further up into the mountains you go, the smaller the fish typically are because it's a shorter growing season, but a lot of fun, like the Upper Judith, all that stuff's really interesting.
It sounds awesome. How well can you do? How good's the fishing?
Oh, it's still a spring creek, so I think 6 to 10 fish a day is a pretty good day.
Yeah. Yeah. Any sense of what the average size fish is?
Oh, it depends. As you're further up the creek, I would say 12 to 13 inches. As you're lower down in the creek, they're going to be more like 16 inches,
Okay.
18
Great.
inches. Warm
Jeez.
Springs Creek, they're going to be, I would say they're a bit bigger, but
Oh,
there's
yeah.
fewer of them, and they get to about I don't know, 18. I've caught them up to 23, 24-inch rainbows in there.
I read some stories about some gigantic fish that have come out of these spring creeks over the years.
Oh, they're huge.
30-inch brown
Yep.
trout.
No, you go to these big browns, and nobody's really quite sure where they sit because there's just not that much deep water
Yeah.
or where they come from, but they do show up and they still catch them.
You hear about these every year, big ones like that, or is it?
No, I wouldn't say so, but you definitely see pictures of them every few years.
Yeah. Hey, anglers, if you're on the hunt for fishing gear that's as tough as you are, look no further than Adams Built Fishing Gear. Since 2014, Adams Built has been the go-to choice for anglers who demand quality without breaking the bank. Their lineup of lightweight waders, high-quality nets, and meticulously designed fly boxes is second to none. But here's what really impressed me. Adams Built stands behind their products like no other. Every single item is guaranteed to last. Yep, you heard that right. And get this, Adams Built waders even come with a lifetime repair replace guarantee, with you only paying for shipping. Now that's a deal you can't beat. So why settle for gear that won't last? Make the smart choice and gear up with Adams Built Fishing Gear today. Ask your local dealer for Adams Built or visit www.adamsbuiltfishing.com and tell them Steve sent you from the Destination Angler podcast. Hey folks, Angler's Coffee wants to fuel your next cast with great coffee delivered to your doorstep, one batch at a time. Anglers has been hard at work making great new coffee blends such as the Stimulator Blend. This high-octane coffee has a delicious smoky flavor with 25% more caffeine. Sometimes you just need a little extra kick in the morning before you wet a line. Or how about the Rainbow Blend? Colorful and bright, this medium roast draws inspiration from the vibrant traits of the iconic fish. Much like the rainbow trout's vivid hues, you'll experience flavor reminiscent of the brilliant colors the trout is named for. And if you like it dark and bold, check out the Brown Trout Blend. This roast brings the spirit of the elusive brown trout with rich, dark chocolate notes, boldly intertwined with subtle smokiness, mirroring the rugged landscapes of the deep waters where brown trout thrive. And with every sip of Angler's Coffee, you support great conservation groups and charities such as the Mayfly Project. So head on over to anglerscoffee.com and fuel up today. Take 20% off your first subscription order by entering the code BREW20 at checkout. All right, so you've been in this industry a long, long time, and I'm kind of curious, I'm curious about what your personal best is in Montana. I'd love to hear a story about that, but then also just any other epic stories you have. I think you took somebody very famous fishing once that you were pretty excited about.
Yeah, I've been really lucky. We've, as far as Montana goes, my personal best, that's a hard question. I'd have to think. I mean, I think I probably caught it when I was a kid. So my judgment as to how large it was may be a little suspect.
Yeah.
But, we used to, as I said, we used to fish Three Brothers. It was almost like the river runs through it. Fishing was a competitive sport. And So you're always trying to look for an advantage over your brothers. And I used to float the inner tube down the Yellowstone to the bridge.
Ha.
I remember catching a 28-inch rainbow on a hopper. And that was probably the best rainbow I've ever caught on a dry fly in Montana.
Did it tow you around a little bit?
Oh, it did. It was really, and then, I let it go. I measured it with my fingers. And so I got no credit. Yeah, exactly. And my
That's
brother's
16
like,
inches. Like,
my brother's like,
exactly,
that
right?
doesn't measure. That doesn't count.
Oh, come on.
And literally 2 weeks later, my brother Jeff floated that same stretch and caught one of similar size. And he made sure he brought it home so there was proof.
Oh, he did.
And it was, there's 28, 29 inches. We don't catch those as much now as we used to be honest with you. And I think that's partially just pressure and,
Sure.
partially water conditions. But so, Montana is still, I think, probably the greatest state in the continental United States for cold water trout fishing. And it consistently attracts a sort of guests, as I was saying, the person I got to guide that really meant the most to me and was by far the most profound experience I've had fishing, I think, was when I took President Obama fishing in 2009.
Holy smokes.
And, I had worked a long time in Montana politics and what have you. And 2008 was a pretty special year for those of us in Montana it was the closest the Democrats ever coming to winning a statewide presidential election in Montana since Bill Clinton kind of won that strange result in 1996 or 92 with three different candidates. And, but Barack Obama got 49.5%. But anyway, he was one of my heroes. And one of my best friends growing up was a guy who ended up becoming his deputy chief of staff in the White House. And I got a phone call one day from 202 and it kept ringing 202. And I figured it was somebody asking for money.
Yeah.
And finally they called the fourth time and they're like, this is the White House. We have somebody who would like to talk to you. And I really thought it was a joke. And next thing I know that he came on with the president and asked if I could take him fishing. And, this was the middle of July. And they said, yeah, we'll be out there in August. I think it was 9th or something like that. And and you can't tell anybody, especially your wife, because my
Really?
wife's a journalist and they didn't want her to break it. So I kept it under my lid. And then they told me, and the other thing is if Kim Jong-il acts up, we won't be coming. So it seemed like there were a lot of variables. To me, it seemed like one of those things where it was too good to be true.
Yeah.
And
Did you like hang up and say, give me a number, I can call you back, to make sure
I
you're not.
should have, but I was completely flabbergasted. And I had the governor of Montana and his Fish and Wildlife Parks director in my truck at the time. Like, who was that? Like, oh, just a friend. Couldn't
Really?
tell them. And so we floated down the river. So then, as time progressed, 3 weeks, he came out to give a presentation and a speech in Belgrade at the airport. And then
Yeah.
they spent the night and he came and they said, originally we had picked Odell Spring Creek to go fishing, but the weather was so bad that day. They're like, God, I don't know if we're going to be able to make it. And then at about one point they said, grab your fishing gear. You're flying on Air Force One with the president. You're going to go fishing. I was like, oh,
You're going to go on Air Force One?
Or
What?
the Marine one, the helicopter.
Yeah,
Marine one,
okay.
I guess it was. And I'm like, okay. So we went to grab our stuff and then this thunderstorm came in and they canceled that. But fortunately I had a backup place that was about 3 miles from the airport. And they said, well, we'll go fish there. And so we went and got everything set up. And, it was the classic situation where they were saying, I was with Secret Service all week and they're like, POTUS was rolling. And next thing you know, helicopters showed up and all these cars came down this 1 mile ranch driveway. And eventually they all peeled off and this one big black Suburban pulled up right in front of me. He got out of the car to say, and everybody was kind of like, as you would, regardless of your politics, it was kind of an impressive display. And he shows up and he goes, hi, I'm Barack Obama. You must be my guide. And I just burst into tears. And at that point I was 42 years old. I was a full-blown adult. And he's like, well, why don't you come with me? And the next thing you knew, I was sitting inside a bedroom talking to him as he was changing out of his formal wear that he'd given a speech into his fishing gear.
Does he wear boxers or briefs?
No answer for that one.
Okay.
And anyway, as he was talking to me, it was one of those classic situations where you have this little voice saying, can you believe this is happening on the side of your... I was having a hard time getting focused because it was still a little overwhelming. And eventually he goes, okay, we're all ready. Let's go fishing. And as soon as I got out on the river, I was no longer nervous. And it's like, okay, now he's in my classroom. And we started fishing and we fished 2.5 hours up. And I just kept thinking to myself, traditionally and typically, when I take a super high profile individual fishing, I know how to balance my curiosity with, I don't always want you to ask too many probing questions.
Yeah. Right.
And with him, I just figured, you know what? This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. Ask. And so I just started asking questions and we talked for 2.5 hours and we got all the way top of this river and we'd been fishing and like the Secret Service was there with the Suburban to take him back to the barn. And he goes, I don't want to go back with them. If I do, I'm going to have to just go into meetings. Can we just fish our way back?
Oh,
So we fished our all the way back. And
Dan, were you in a drift boat or were you waiting?
no, that was one of the really interesting things about him. So like when Dick Cheney used to come out and fish all the time in Montana, we were told, okay, you have to be off the river at 2 o'clock because the vice president's getting on this stretch of river at 2. You guys have to be off it by 2. And that was my initial suggestion because I knew that was much more controllable for me and I could easier fishing. And his response was, no, I don't want to displace that many people on vacation. I just want to be as unobtrusive as possible. So we found this private ranch and took him fishing. And, his staff caught fish. He unfortunately did not land a fish.
He did not?
No, he did not. He brought this rod and I brought a really nice, like a 508 Sage or something, and which was ideal for the day. And he's like, I'm really sorry I can't use that because the Secret Service gave me this for my 50th birthday and they'd made him a fly rod, which was more like a 12 weight. And so we were having a hard time hooking smaller fish.
Yeah.
Because every time you lift the rod like this, the fly would go 30 feet.
You knock their eyeballs cross-eyed.
Yeah. So we didn't land a fish, but we had a really good time. And, it's just one of those deals where and it's one of the reasons, and I think one of the things that is so unique about the fly fishing business for a kid from Montana is that you get the opportunity to meet people and experience people that you normally never would. And that's because they want to come out here and experience this. And the reason he came out here was that he said that he'd made a promise when he was running against Hillary in the primary, that if he won the primary and eventually the presidency, he'd come back and learn how to fly fish in Montana. So I was lucky enough to be the guy that took him.
How did you get picked?
Just because my buddy, honestly, it wasn't because I was the best fly fishing guy at all. It was just my friend was the deputy chief of staff.
Okay.
And
says, I got a guy for you.
He's got the guy. And we were as prominent as anybody else at that time. Certainly no better at fishing, but had a big reputation. So, and I did a lot of work in the Democratic Party politics. So it all kind of worked together. And for me, it was just an honor of it's hard to even fathom. It was just a real honor.
I'll say that's a great story. And what kind of an angler was Barack Obama with a 12 weight?
He was great. And so that was one of the things I tell people is like, typically when you take these high powered people that have 50 people yelling in their ears about all the things they need to keep track of, it's really hard to get their attention.
Yeah.
But he was literally one guy who, when you told him something, he listened and he actually locked it in and he implemented it into what he was doing, which I found pretty unique because he was actually listening.
Smart guy, I guess.
Yeah, all those guys are probably pretty smart, but not all of them listen particularly well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. All right. So I want to shift gears a little bit here. Great story. Thanks for sharing that. So not many people can say they grew up along the banks of the Yellowstone River. What was that like?
Oh God, it was like Montana in the 70s and 80s. For me, it was pretty idyllic.
Yeah.
When you went out on the river, you'd see 2 boats on a busy day. And the other part of that as I grew up, my dad was one of the few doctors that worked out on the Crow Reservation in the 70s. So when the Bighorn got closed down by the Supreme Court in 1976, we were some of the only people that got to fish it because my dad was he took care of a lot of the Crow tribal members as a physician. And so they were like, doctor, you made me feel, come fish. And so we had that whole Bighorn to ourselves.
Oh my God.
For 6 years.
What was it like back then?
All we did was fish Royal Wolfson's little light spruce flies. That was it.
On top the whole time. No nymphing, nothing.
Nothing. No size 20. What was that?
And catching like these 16 and 18 carbon copy bighorn
beautiful
trout.
brown trout. It was just,
Yeah.
it was a really cool time. But Yellowstone was the same way. The thing we really liked about the Yellowstone is, because it is technically the longest free flowing river in the United States. And you just never knew what you were going to catch.
Yeah. Super cool.
And, that it had a sense of mystery. And that's one of the things I'd want to impart to your listeners is that when you get out of Montana's cold water fisheries and you move into kind of like what I'd call our hybrid fisheries that are cold water and warm water, like the Yellowstone, when you get down below Billings, you catch trout, you catch smallmouth, you catch sturgeon, you catch paddlefish, you catch pike. I mean, it's all there. And so it's a pretty neat fishery. And the hard part about eastern Montana and central Montana, other than the spring creeks we were talking about earlier, is that fishing access sites are further apart, but you can really have some incredible fishing.
Yeah. Tell me something, growing up in Montana, what do you love most about Montana? But what do you love least about Montana, if there's anything?
What do I love least about Montana is just how polarized it's become.
You mean politically?
Yeah, just culturally, politically, socially.
Culturally too.
It's true. We've been here all our lives versus you've been here only 50 years versus you've only been here 2 years, that sort of stuff. Cultural values, how we teach our kids, what we teach them. We're having the same challenges because after COVID, our population exploded. And we went through about 10 years of population change in 2 years. And so we're struggling with that a lot. And typically, when people see a lot of new people around them, they tend to respond poorly. What do I love most about Montana is that if you're pulled over on the side of the road with a flat tire, somebody still stops and helps you. And if you knock on a door and you're a nice person, you can typically find a place to hunt and fish.
How about that?
A lot of folks don't necessarily go through the formalities it takes. I mean, hunting and fishing is not a right, it's a privilege on private water and private land. And so they need to be able to, but I've found that most Montanans, if you treat them with respect and you knock on the door, not at 5 a.m,
right?
Don't interrupt them when they're trying to fix your tractor. But, when you're socially smart about how you interact with them and how you don't impose yourself on their lives, you're going to get access.
I used to do a lot of quail hunting in southern Indiana where I'm from. And I found that the guys that show up the day of and want to go hunting, they get a lot of no's. But the guys who show up like in September to go quail hunting in November, and maybe bring a tube of Jimmy Dean pork sausage along with them, something like that. I remember one time I knocked on a farmer's door and everyone knew this guy let no one hunt. And I must have been the only guy that showed up in September. And he kind of says, "Oh yeah, you're one of those guys that shows up early and you probably like to help out around the farm, don't you?" I was like, and he says, "We're cutting hogs. You want to help?" And I'm like,
off you went.
Then he laughed because he knew I didn't know what the heck what that even meant, but I think I know what it means now. But that's what he used to do. And it worked great.
It does work well. And I think, if you think about how kids communicate today or how probably we all communicate a little more today, it's more virtual, more through text, less direct communication. Getting hunting and fishing access is the same thing. They want to know who you are. They want to see your face, and they want to, because they're entrusting you with their most valuable possession. And there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong, and they don't need your complication in their lives. So you're their guest.
All right. So growing up in Montana, there are 3 of you guys, 3 brothers, right? I'm just trying to think, what did you do for fun as a kid out in rural Montana, and did you get in any trouble as a kid that you'd be willing to share?
Oh, we didn't really, probably not stuff that I'm willing to share. We spent a lot of time fishing. We didn't go to our senior prom per se. We went down and fished the Bighorn.
You went fishing.
We were getting out of school at 3:30 in the afternoon in Billings, drive down to the Bighorn, get there at about 5 o'clock, fish the mid-hatch until 9, get home at 10:30, tie flies, and then go to school the next morning. So that was what we did. We weren't, the high school I went to was pretty big. So we were sort of the fly fishing geeks that lived we got in our trucks and off we went fishing, and wouldn't have it any other way. And my dad, he grew up in Western Kansas, and when he moved to Montana to be a doctor, he's realized, because he'd seen it happen where he was from, all the good pheasant ground had been leased up from guys from Denver or what have you. And the first thing he did, even before he bought a house in Montana, was buy some acreage on the Yellowstone. And, back then he bought 100 acres for something like $30,000
Oh my
with about a
gosh.
mile of riverfront. And so over time we've added to that. And, now we run a fishing lodge there. So it's put a conservation easement on it. And it's anybody who lives in Montana and has lived here a long time or has just gotten here, kind of when it gets like anywhere, but when it gets a hold of your soul, you're kind of stuck.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not leaving Montana, just like
Nope.
Brad Pitt said, huh? Oh, brother, I'll
Uh-huh.
never leave Montana.
That is a true story.
Okay. So you lived overseas as a
Yep.
kid as well. What took you overseas?
Well, my mom was a Spanish teacher, and then my dad had a sabbatical. He was in the Peace Corps. So in the early 60s and traveled around Latin America in the early 60s when the trout fishing was actually really good in places like Ecuador and Peru. Now Chile and Argentina are great fishing, but so he spent a lot of time down there. And honestly, when I was 16, I was an exchange student in Bolivia. And as soon as I left that, I used that Spanish every chance I could get to go back down there to fish. And our timing was really fortunate because all this stuff was new, and we had an expertise. Americans wanted to travel, and we could kind of bridge that gap for them and make it doable in a short period of time. And that's kind of how we built our business. And the having the language skills. Like I said, after we went to Russia, literally in 1995, we had a kid who, Michael Karanchi's partner, Mark Johnstead.
Yeah. Michael's the guy I just did the show with on
Yeah.
Mongolia a couple months ago. Yep.
So his partner is a guy named Mark Johnstead, who literally grew up just down the street from us in Billings.
Yeah.
And he and his buddy came home from Mongolia in 1992 or three, and they had some pictures of these fish they were catching called a taimen. And we said, those are the biggest fish we've ever seen on a fly rod. They were just awesome specimens. And they had a fax number for a guy who could take his time in fishing in Mongolia. And so we sent a fax in 1995, literally went over there, and I had just graduated and just passed the bar exam. So I guess it was 96. And probably like a week later, I found myself on the banks of the river in Mongolia. And my third cast caught a fish that was, to this day, seems like the biggest taimen I'd ever caught.
Wow.
And, it looked like a spring creek. It was a big, huge lake release spring creek type river. And we had no idea what we were going to find. And we just threw this big old fly. The Mongolians all stopped and shot prairie dogs with their guns, and they used those with treble hooks. And we had our mouse patterns. And, I had threw this mouse pattern across this run, stripping it in. And I just kind of had this subtle, what looked like a pretty subtle strike. It's like, oh, I got one. And it felt big. And the next thing I know, the thing jumped out of the water.
Oh
And
my
it's like any
gosh.
kid, you just couldn't even believe what you saw. And we didn't have nets. We had nothing. And so fortunately my brother was there and he took that picture. It's kind of an iconic picture in our company of a guy holding a fish or reeling in a fish behind a weed bed. And the fish looks more like an alligator, but it's closer to a 60-inch taimen. We didn't measure it, but we guessed it at 60. And
That's
it was
huge.
so big, I couldn't even lift it up.
Oh, wow.
And at that time, I was 6'4" and 30 years old. So I had the skill set at that time to lift it up.
All right. So we are going to get into some Spring Creek tactics and techniques, but I do want to ask you about Sweetwater, your company. So how did you become the world's largest owner operator of fly fishing lodges? Give us the short story on that.
The short story is we just started, we're fishermen, right? So we're always exploring new destinations. And we kept expanding the opportunities. And at some point, and it's starting to happen again, but we're the ones starting to transition out while a new generation transitions in. But there were some opportunities like in Alaska and British Columbia where guys had started these lodges in the 50s and 60s. They were now in their 70s and just weren't as into. And so we typically would step in and buy those with a group of investors and then manage them over time and acquire ownership from our investors. And literally, Mongolia was our first formal operation that we owned
Really?
ourselves.
No kidding.
And my brother Jeff sold his truck. We took a bunch of pictures when we were over there and brought these pictures home, designed a trip, sent it to Frontiers. They said, we'll sell it. Started collecting deposits and built this camp. And literally, the camp, the guests landed in their helicopter, and we had gotten gas set up. I mean, it took us a month. It was very stressful because we were just getting started. And honestly, like, I guess it was our second week we were there. 6 of our fishermen got held up at gunpoint and had all their gear taken.
What?
And we thought, well, hell, we're done. There is no way we're going to come back from this. And that evening, we hear this thump, thump, thump. There's a big helicopter coming in from the Capitol, and it was the head of the National Police. And he got in a Jeep, drove up, arrested the guy that did it, got all our gear back, gave us our boat back, and we've never had a problem, knock on wood.
No
So
kidding. Good law enforcement.
we've had some near misses.
Holy
And
smokes.
so there's been good fortune, lots of it,
Yeah.
a little bit of reckless fearlessness, I guess, as well. And then just a real desire to explore. You know, anybody who's a fly angler can really relate to the idea of what's around the corner, what's around the bend. And we were blessed to be born in a time where when you think about what's around the bend from a traveling and a fishing perspective, it could be what's on that continent because you can get there. And so that's really how we looked at things. And we just sort of started to explore opportunities that excited us. And, you know, over time, we're lucky enough to sort of acquire and build just several of these really iconic fishing lodges around the world.
Right. So you've got lodges where?
We own the Lower Dean River Lodge. We own the Steelhead Valhalla. We've got the Moss. We've got the Volker. So those all 4 in like north central BC for steelhead. In Alaska, we've got one out on the Aleutians, one on the Copper River Lodge out of Iliamna, and then one in Red River Tikchik State Park outside of Dillingham. That's a fly out. And then the ones in Mongolia, one time we had 3 camps. Now we just operate 2. You know, Mongolia was one of the first places we learned the hard lesson that when you run a camp that people look at the trip as a one-time sort of deal, once in a lifetime trip. It's hard to find new people every year.
Right.
Like our lodges in Alaska, Montana, BC, our repeat rate's 70 to 90%, right?
Wow.
So you have to go out and find 10%, 10% of your guests have to be new every year. Whereas Mongolia, even if you have a great season, people will come back, not the next year, but maybe in 2 years, right? So it's just a harder, for me at least, for us, it's been a harder operation to fill. Then, you know, we started a bone fishing operation in French Polynesia in about 2000. And it was a liveaboard. And that didn't, you know, it was a great trip, but we just couldn't find the fishing. We just couldn't find good enough fishing to really get it to run. You had to really be into it. And so great trips, but not great fishing, if that's all you were into. And then, you know, we were still running Mongolia, and obviously we had operations in Mongolia, in Montana. And then one of the things we started in 1997 that's been probably the operation and the thing we've enjoyed the most is our guide school. So we run a guide school out of our ranch on the Yellowstone, as well as our lodge on the Bighorn. And, you know, we started that in 1997. I bet we run about 120 to 140 students a year through it.
Nice.
Over the course of 12 weeks, 10, 14 weeks some years. And we, you know, typically have close to 100% booking. You know, as far as if you want a job, we'll help you get a job.
Yeah, that's super cool.
The thing that we've really enjoyed about that as much as anything is just being around a bunch of young people that are as excited about fishing as we are. So that's been really cool. It's like running a basketball camp for fly fishing kids. It's super fun.
So you do Brazil and the Bahamas as well, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Brazil, I mean, I think our peacock bass operation, we just manage it. We don't own it. But the peacock bass operation, I think it's a clear water fishery. So, you know, if the water's high, it's not clear, but as the water drops during the dry season, it gets really low and really, really visible. So it's great. We set it up with flats, boats of sorts. And so we pull our way down the river and sight fish. And then the Bahamas, it's called Mangrove K Club. So it's on the middle bight of Andros. And I think it's, you know, it's as nice a bone fishing lodge as you'll find down there.
Yeah.
And we bought that in 2011. And then I think that's about it.
Well, that's about it. And then you guys have a Sweetwater Ranches Company. Did I read this correctly? That you help people buy ranches?
We do, yeah. We used to do. I do some ranch real estate.
Okay.
Really, mostly that's very opportunistic. So when you get some guy in your boat that says, "I'm thinking about buying a ranch," rather than passing it off to some guy in fake cowboy boots and a fancy scarf, I'd rather take it myself.
And then you served on the Montana Fish and Wildlife and Parks Commission. You're actually head of it for a while.
Yep.
How was that?
It was, of all the things I've done in public service, it was by far the most rewarding, because it's so, hunting and fishing and fish and wildlife are sort of my natural passions. And to be in a position where you could use your anecdotal knowledge to work with scientists to craft fish and wildlife policy for the betterment of those species in the state was absolutely invigorating. The two big issues we dealt with was the delisting of wolves and getting them into a position where we could hunt them, and then the grizzly bear.
Huh.
Same thing.
Same thing with grizzly bears. Okay.
Yep.
That's fascinating. Well, thanks for doing that. All of us here in the fishing public appreciate people like you that are willing to get their hands dirty and exercise that law degree for the greater public good, I guess.
That's the idea. And,
Yes, all right.
there were those that said it wasn't for the greater good, but I believe most of my decisions were the right ones.
A little bit controversial.
It's political
maybe.
either way.
Yeah. All right. So let's shift gears. I want to come back to spring creeks because maybe not everybody listening has been to a spring creek, but they're typically, spring creeks are super selective trout, slow meandering water. Fish have forever to look at your fly, tiny fly, 6, 7X tippet, high potential for a frustrating day.
Yep.
Just in general, maybe not just up in Warm Springs and Big Springs, but in general, what are some of your pro tips for people heading out to spring creeks?
Oh, the number one tip I'd give anybody fishing a spring creek, whether it's the super refined fishing, fish of like the Pews and O'Hares, or it's the less refined ones of central Montana, is take your time approaching them. Don't just come into a run and start casting. I try to always get people to stand back, stand below, and just watch the ripple, watch the run for 5-10 minutes, have a soda pop, have a cup of coffee.
That's
whatever.
hard to do when you've driven like hours to get somewhere.
Fish rising, but you got to learn how these fish move, because if you watch spring creek trout in particular, they have sort of a routine, and they will do this. They'll make the same moves over and over and over.
Yeah.
And once you learn how they're going to move, you can learn when to cast, where to cast. And then if you have a bad cast, and so often you see anglers do this, they make a cast that's not quite right.
Yeah.
And instead of just letting it fish through, they try to rip it off the water to make the perfect cast. You're just better to let it go through, because the fish, it could be some baling twine floating down the river, right? Or a piece of grass.
Doesn't spook them.
But as soon as you go like this and go, and like, oh, I've heard that before.
Yeah,
so, it's being subtle, being careful, and then just really watching what's going on. One of the things you'll see, one of the things I learned when I first started guiding spring creeks was an old guy here in Livingston. He said, because sometimes when you're on a spring creek, you're going to see 2 or 3 hatches happening at once. And you're trying to figure out, am I using the caddis, the mayfly, or the midge? And, really watching what they're eating, understanding the difference between a dry fly take and an emerger take.
Say more about that. Maybe some people don't know what you mean by that.
Well, so like typically what you're going to see is when it's a dry fly take, you're going to see a mouth, right? Like this. Yeah. When you see an emerger take, you're going to see sort of the pectoral fin or the dorsal fin as it comes over, because they're coming up and that little insect's floating its way to the surface, and they come down and they like that. So you see more of the back.
Gotcha.
But if it's a dry fly sitting on the top, they just come up underneath. And so that's really what I look for.
Yeah.
Splashy rises. And it's the other thing is, if you have 5 or 6 fish working in a run, trying to take the fish on the outside first means typically the biggest fish are in the front, right? They've got the best feeding lane. But it's almost like a flock of geese. They're typically in some sort of formation. Don't be afraid to pick off the small guys in back.
Do you risk, though, putting the big guy down and you never get him?
You do. But you also risk, if you cast the big guy right away, you risk putting the other 5 fish down.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, you have to read the situation, but you've got time. And that's the thing about spring creeks. It's not like with a boat where you're floating down the river and you've got a fairly limited access point and a fairly limited opportunity to present your fly to that fish, when you're standing on the bank or in the middle of the river, you've got all the time in the world. Take it.
Yeah.
Find out what that fish is doing and make the right cast.
And how important is exactly matching the hatch up on these two spring creeks we've been talking about in central Montana?
I would say in central Montana, it's probably size matters, size and color, but not like the spring creeks down by Paradise Valley where you'll see the fish come up and look at a natural
Yeah.
and say that doesn't look quite right. The fish in central Montana, they're not dumb, but you can't get away with everything, but you have a little bit more margin for error.
A little more margin then. Let me ask you something. Are fish actually smarter in spring creeks, or are they pretty much the same intelligence everywhere? They just behave differently?
I think they just learned the hard way in spring creeks. Certainly on Depews. I mean, some of those fish get caught 4 or 5 times a summer, right?
Yeah.
So they're kind of like, and they see fishermen every day. These spring creek fish up in central Montana do not see fishermen every day.
Wow. There's a reason to go right there, folks.
Yep.
Who's the best angler you've ever seen on a spring creek? Anybody come to mind? And what are they doing?
Oh, I would say the best angler I know on the spring creek is probably either a guy named Brad Oswald here in Livingston or a Jan Axel in Livingston. They're both, I couldn't guide our spring creeks every day. It would drive me completely batty because it's, it's hard fishing. And if you have really skilled anglers, even yourself, I mean, sometimes they can be a little bit frustrating, right?
Yeah.
For the angler and for the guidance part. But these guys they're so into it and they really know the intricacies of what's going on. And the more detailed your knowledge, the more successful you
What are
are.
you going to do? Yeah. I was going to ask you, I mean, do you feel like you ought to try to get a guide to go up to these Lewiston spring creeks?
The spring creeks up there just don't have guides. And so typically that I'm aware of, there was a guy that guided a few years ago, but I checked his website the other day. I checked his Facebook page and he's gone flying
He's
for
gone.
about 5
Really?
years.
But you guys go up there, right?
We go up there and fish too, but we mostly don't take guests because it's, you have to make it's kind of a 2 or 3 day commitment, right?
Oh, okay.
Because, from our lodge on the Yellowstone, it's a good 2-hour drive up. So it just makes for a lot of drive time. If you get people that want to come show up on a Thursday night, fish Friday and Saturday on the spring creeks and drive home, that's something we can do pretty easily. There's no fishing lodges up there. You end up staying in local bed and breakfast or hotels and eating at cowboy cafes, which is great.
Yeah. I mean, a less pressured, a less bougie experience, more of a rural experience in Montana.
It's very much the Montana we all grew up with.
I mean, that sounds awesome to me.
It is.
And you can wade, you can get in there and wade. And I think, it'd be great to go up there with somebody who knew what they were doing, but it might be a good place just to kind of splash around and explore for a couple of days.
Well, and you can go to, that's the one thing about these spring creeks around there in central Montana is that because the fish aren't quite as sophisticated, they're easier to catch fish and they're easier to get a handle on as an individual than something like Depews or like the stuff down by Livingston.
Yeah.
Because they act more like fish in a freestone, honestly. I mean, once the stuff right up by the hatchery, they act like spring creek fish. But as you get below,
yeah,
they act more like freestone fish.
Are you always upstream, casting upstream towards them?
Pretty much.
Are you? What size tippets do you need up there?
Oh, 5X.
Oh, okay.
6X occasionally. If I'm fishing up higher where the water's uber clear, then I'll probably be using 6 and 7. But as I get down below, and because I remember we were talking about how there's a lot of haying as you get down into the valley a bit. So the water has a little more color, not off color, but it just has a little more sediment to it, so you can get away with a lot more.
Are you changing your rod when you're going down to 6 and 7X? A little slower
I don't.
rod? Oh, you
No,
don't?
I don't.
Really?
But I use a 5-weight Sage RPL or whatever I have pretty much.
Really?
It's really about having a tippet that lays out nicely, but I don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out the right rod for it. Cause a lot of times, like, especially on those creeks, you're fishing different types of water all day.
Yeah. I was, years ago, I was fishing with my son on Depews, and I was taking his 2 college roommates. We'd been backpacking and we're like, we got to spend a day on Depews, and we got there early in the morning. we're catching nothing, right? And it's blowing like 25 miles an hour. We've got 6X tippet. It's falling back in your face. The only way you could cast is just hold your rod up in the air with the wind behind you and let it flutter. But there's a
Yep.
massive hatch going on right at that time. We're like, what in the world are these fish taking? We could not figure it out. So, there's that fly shop on Depew's property. And so
Yep.
we drove, across the,
Talk to
the
Buzz.
property, buzzes, and nobody's there. And we're reading the sign, the sign on the,
Yeah,
on the
I
front
do.
door. It says open most days about 8 or 9, occasionally as early as 7, but some days as late as 10 or 11. That was our day. The guy showed up like
Yep.
at noon. Then close about 5 or 6, occasionally 4 or 5, sometimes as late as 7. And he goes on to say, sometimes you're never here. So I'm like, is this guy going to show up? And he finally showed up, and it was a size 24 sulfur. I didn't know sulfurs got that small.
Yeah. So that must have been like late July, early August.
Yeah, it was. And this lady showed up who was probably in her late 70s, khaki suit from head to toe, something you'd see out of the 1970s or 80s. And she is popping fish off of the opposite bank, like one after the other after the other. She was really good. I found out she's got like a annual pass. I guess you can buy an annual
Yeah, you can
pass.
buy a season pass.
The
Yeah.
season pass. She really knew what she was doing. And sure enough, I walked up and she was using a size, 24, sulfur. And so we ended up catching a few fish. But one of my son's friends just wandered off and just kind of went for a run in Paradise Valley. We didn't see him for a couple hours. He just totally, quit. So I don't know. I feel like Spring Creek's, it's great if you like the challenge, and it's typically beautiful water and you can see these trout, but you kind of have to have a mindset for them.
You do. And that's one of the things that we really, it's sort of like timing fishing or steelhead fishing.
Yeah.
If you're doing this sort of fishing because you want to catch a lot of fish, you may be frustrated. Like, the thing I love about Spring Creek fish is the quality of the fish that you get an opportunity to interact with is super high.
Yeah.
And I find that if you're patient and you approach them slowly, you'll learn more about how fish behave on a Spring Creek than I think you can on any other river. Because where else do you get to watch fish so intensively feeding from, ground, rooting around, getting nymphs,
Yeah.
eating emergers, eating dry flies, and then eating the fish the spinners. So that's what's really cool about it's a great trout classroom.
Yeah. All right. Nearing the end here, Dan, to close out the show here, I got some rapid fire questions for you. All right.
Sure.
First paying job.
Paper route.
When I'm not fishing, you'll find me
Watching soccer
Premier League.
as much as possible because it comes on at like 5 a.m, so I can watch before my kids get up.
Okay. Who's the most meaningful person in your life?
Oh, I think it's more my parents and my family. I mean, it's just, we're a really tight knit family. My brothers,
Cool.
we've been working together ever since we were little kids. My parents were great at giving us the opportunity to roam around and explore and not be too fearful. And then, my wife and I are trying to share that same sort of love of the outdoors, love of adventure with our kids as our parents, hers and mine, did with us.
That's
And
awesome.
we have a profound love of this state, and that helps a lot too.
Best day of your life.
Oh, that's a tricky one, but I think I might have described it when I went fishing with President Obama back in 2009.
Yeah.
That was, to me, that was just the culmination of my career, and from the perspective of just getting to do something I never thought I'd be able to do. But all of the fishing that we've done, like, we grew up in Montana, and my dad was a physician, so we had more opportunity than most. But for us, going to Alaska was considered, if you get lucky, someday you'll get to do that. And then,
Yeah.
you start to work there, and then it just, the way life sometimes unfolds and opportunities present themselves. And we made sure we did our best to grab the ones we wanted and could.
If your mother wrote a book about you, what would it be called?
Why did he do that?
Okay. We'll double click on that just for another a follow-up comment.
She was My Three Sons Who Love to Fish, and
That'd be a good one.
and how it brought them together or kept them together.
Best piece of advice you've ever gotten?
That's a pretty easy one. That was another guy I got to take fishing back in the early 90s, was a guy named Paul Volker. And I'd gone to college, and during the time when he was sort of the economist of note, and he had sort of tamed the high inflation of the early 80s. And I was guiding him one-on-one. I just read a book about him, and I was super into his career, and I was guiding him one-on-one down the river, and walking him down this river in Russia. And I just said to him, Mr. Volker, if you had any piece of advice for a young man like me, what would you do? And he actually set his fly rod down, turned around and looked at me and said, son, I would tell you to make a positive difference in the world. Do something you love and do something that leaves the world a better place. And that's stuck with me for a long time.
Not make more money.
Not make more money, no.
Yeah. What do you wish you had more time to do?
Fish.
Fish.
I mean,
good answer.
You know, it's like, if I could, I love to fish. And the hardest part about one of the reasons we don't guide hunters is that if you do fishing every day for a job, it does tend to become a job and less of a, it's still a passion of mine. I still love where they fish, but I've caught a lot of fish in my day. So I don't know. I mean, I think I have a better rounded, more substantive approach to a good day of fishing now than I did when I was 25.
Yeah.
You know, there's more to the day than what you bring in.
Where's a guy like you who's got lodges all around the world? Where do you go for vacation?
Usually fishing. I've been lucky enough to take my kids to most of our lodges, and but you know, I think that's changing now that our kids are about to go to college and start to spread off and do other stuff. My vacations will be less about fishing and more about visiting my kids wherever they're at. But you know, people always look at my life and say, "Oh, you already are on vacation."
Exactly.
But it is work. So it's work, but it's good work.
Yeah.
Fun work.
Favorite shore lunch?
Oh, that's a tricky one too. I think probably when I used to work guide down in Argentina, and we'd have those big parrilladas on the side of the bank and drink wine before.
Is that one of the little guinea pigs? Is that what you're talking about?
No. It's like where they do those big barbecues with a pig or a.
Oh, big pig. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's big meals. I like meat.
Favorite place to eat and drink at the end of the day? Let's say up in Lewiston. Where do you go for a meal up there?
Oh, the place you want to go is the brewery there in town. I think it's called Central Montana Milling or something like that. It's a brew pub with a great restaurant and a great atmosphere.
Hey, if they got a brewery, can't be all bad.
They do. It's a cool place. I mean, that's the thing. The other thing about, like, you go to places like Bozeman and Livingston now, you know, there's really nice restaurants, but they're not that different. You go to Central Montana or rural Montana, it's more traditional Montana food. A lot of great steaks, a lot of great burgers, some iceberg lettuce salads, but wonderful people. And the restaurant's called Central Feed.
Central Feed. There you go, folks. Yep. And I used to always, you know, when I'm out hunting in the rural parts of Indiana, I'm looking for the place with the most pickup trucks. That's where I'm going for lunch.
Good hash browns and even better French fries.
That's right. That's right. Oh my gosh. Thanks for being on the show, Dan. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, great. How can people get in touch with you?
You know, you can either reach us at on our regular phone, which is 406-222-0624, or just sweetwatertravel.com.
Wait, you answer your phone? That's unusual.
I try.
Okay.
This week hasn't been a good example.
Well, some weeks are worse than others, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, I wish you extraordinary success in all your adventures to follow, Dan. I'm sure there'll be many. And folks, thank you for listening. We'll be sure to post Dan's contact information on the Destination Angler show notes. And hopefully we'll get some exclusive pictures of his fly picks for these spring creeks. We'll put those out on Facebook and Instagram. You can DM me or email me with comments and suggestions at shaig@destinationanglerpodcast.com. Hey, if you like the show, please share it with a buddy. As always, our music is by A Brothers Fountain, a great band out of Colorado. Hope you enjoyed the show. Tight lines, everybody. Until next time.
Well, I'll go from the land to the shining sea. But I know there's more to life than what the eye can see.